First off, I actually want to give a shout out. They're not an official sponsor, but they've been very friendly with us, which is Polar Bear, the poll making software we use. I like them because most of you agree with me. The assessment I made about the Luol Deng trade is that Chicago really won the trade, and Cleveland kind of made a foolish maneuver. And like I said, most of you on the polls agreed with me. Some of you in the comments, actually, a lot of you in the comments agreed with me as well. So that's kind of the first thing. I thought this was a slam dunk for Chicago. I thought this was a really wise move because what they were essentially doing is saying, we have 50 games left of Luol Deng, at the end of which we're going to have to let him walk out the door. He'd already turned down a 3-year, $10 million a year extension. And frankly, that's pushing it for me in terms of what I think his value is. That actually makes me a little scared. Anytime you're offering a player $10 million a year, they really should be a marquee player. Luol Deng's pretty young, but he's got a lot of wear and tear on him, thanks to Coach Thibodeau. So losing that is kind of harsh, but bringing him back for more than $10 million a year is not acceptable. So he's probably, with what he's produced the last couple of years, which is about 6 wins a year, about right around $10 million if you look at the value of a win at about $1.7 million. Something Patrick points out, and this is really key, is you really want to get better contracts than that, because if you think of getting fair market value for your wins, what's going to happen is you're going to make a 41-win team, which is not what you want to do. Paying all of your salary cap for a 41-win team isn't an ideal strategy. You have to look for better values, which is what wise people in the NBA do. So Luol Deng at right around $10 million as his real value for a mediocre team, I would probably, this is going to sound mean, I would like him at a mid-level exception given his age. Well, Dunleavy's been a good pickup. He's older, so I'm worried, but he's playing good minutes, so that helps. Jimmy Butler was injured, and now he's back. And the other thing to just really consider is just how bad the East is this year. Now, the question you would have to ask yourself if you're Chicago is, would keeping Luol Deng make us competitive against Miami or Indiana, who are really the only, the rest of the East looks terrible. Those two teams, really strong. And I don't think he would. But the thing is, if you can get into the playoffs, and the Bulls currently are in the playoffs, I believe they're the 5th or 6th seed, and, you might stand a chance of making the second round as long as you're not playing Miami or Indiana. So really, I just said, losing Deng, because he's about six wins a year, there's 50 games left, so that's 4 wins. If Jimmy Butler comes back healthy and stays healthy, they've got Joakim Noah, who's always good. Dunleavy stays healthy for another season. They can still compete this season. We talked a little bit about this Deng's value to Cleveland, and actually you kind of jumped the gun there and preemptively brought it up, which is can Cleveland make the playoffs? Because that is really the only way this trade works for Cleveland. And in fact, if they make the playoffs because of Luol Deng's production, which I don't think is the case, then I will renege and say, of course, any year you could spend 3 second-round draft picks to get into the playoffs. All I wanted to really show was there were 2 trends, and I thought that chart did it very well. Trend 1 is Luol Deng's salary is doing this. It's been going up and getting more expensive year to year. Even if next year it took a dip, the way raises in the NBA work, it would still likely be going up, although I think they were doing the same. But it would still be high. Whereas if you look at his production, it's stagnated. And this is actually a major problem for Cleveland, because when you get older players whose productions have stagnated, you're in trouble because you're still going to have to pay them. This is the problem with Kobe. Every year you're in the NBA, your value goes up and up and up in terms of what you can get paid. You hit a certain threshold, you're not worth as much. And we see that on Deng's chart perfectly. And so he's actually kind of a time bomb for whichever team has them, which is why I think Cleveland lost, because if they don't re-sign him, they're going to get mocked for this. And rest assured, peer pressure works on GMs. Whereas Chicago has now wisely let themselves out of a tough decision, which they knew they would have, which is, are we going to have to pay Deng more than $10 million a season at the end of this year? Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's what Cleveland did. Cleveland has rented a player for 50 games. And apologies for the background noise, but this is one of those areas that I see people run into trouble often, and that's the concept of a rental. Just a second. Yeah, apologies. So anyway, the concept of Yeah, I apologize. There's background noise and I don't want to scream, but the concept of rental is you get a player for a very short period of time and it costs you assets. So in this case, it's cost them a possible first round pick and two second round picks at overall, at least three second round picks over the next 3 years. And what are they going to get in return for that? And like I said, Luol Deng's probably going to win them another 3-4 wins this season. Probably will fall short of the playoffs. They're 6 games out of the playoffs right now, which means you've really spent some very valuable things. I think draft picks, the top ones are overrated. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the show. But on their own, if you want to stock your roster with non-marquee talent, draft picks are the best way to go. A second round pick is a little over $1 million for the first 2 years. You get the rights to their third and fourth year, often very cheap as well. And you get restricted free agency in their fifth year. So you basically get a very cheap player for 5 seasons. And they've got, essentially Cleveland just gave up 3 of those. You look at Deng. Deng is a good player who will not help them into the playoffs and will put them with a very costly decision at the end of it. So that's a bad rental. A good rental is one that really improves your team. And the one I want to give you here is actually Andre Iguodala. This is one of those that I see people say the Nuggets totally lost out. They messed up. How could they, they gave up Aaron Aflalo and a draft pick for Andre Iguodala, and what were they thinking? He's not on the team. But of course, Andre Iguodala helped them win 57 wins, which was a franchise best. They were the favorites in the playoffs in the first round. There was some bad coaching on George Karl and some bad luck. They lost Danilo Gallinari, but that's a good rental. When you significantly improve your team and significantly improve your odds of making it far in the playoffs and win the trade, I still think they won that trade. If we look at the overall value. Oh yeah, so that's a fantastic rental because that's a rental that gets a lot of flack. The Lakers are kind of pointed out for being stupid for doing that. By the way, Dwight Howard's like, a 19.9 rebound guy right now in Houston. I'm sure no team in the NBA wants that. In his case, though, I would argue it's a good rental. And part of the funny part about the Dwight Howard rental is actually one of the advantages you get in a rental, which is the option to get the player back at the end. And that's another reason I'm calling the Luol Deng rental a bad rental. Getting the option on Luol Deng at the end of the season isn't really a big edge, whereas getting the option for Dwight Howard at the end of the season was a fantastic edge. And that would also be why I would mark down the Kenyon Martin and Carmelo Anthony trades. Getting the option on that player doesn't help you that much. If a player is better than there's a value of like contract value to wins. If a player exceeds that, then of course a max contract's in your favor. Due to the current rules, you can never pay Kevin Durant or LeBron James enough money. And Dwight Howard was one of the players on the same thing. You just couldn't pay him enough money, so that's an exploitive contract. Whereas, as I mentioned, Luol Deng, I'd probably put his value somewhere in the $5 to $8 million range. So getting the right to maybe re-sign him for a large amount of money isn't very helpful. I believe you said Ethan Sherwood Strauss said, how funny is it going to be when the tanking Bulls, make the playoffs and the Cleveland Cavaliers miss out? And this was one of the reasons, by the way, I didn't think the right to swap picks in a year was necessarily that beneficial because I still think Chicago is a better team than Cleveland. Now, in regards to that, in regards to tanking, I have a slightly nuanced view about that, which is to say, I view tanking as intentionally making yourself worse with the intention of improving your draft stock. I do not view any trade that is a good trade as long as you can make the statement that a trade was good without having to suffix it with anything about the draft, you cannot qualify that move as tanking. And so in this case, as I mentioned, I think 50 games of Luol Deng, who I think is a good but not great player on a team that has the ability to handle losing him, for 3 second-round picks over the next 3 years, essentially an extra second-round pick each year, which means, the Bulls are going to keep their bottom line very low. If you're every year, teams kind of have to restock role players. If the Bulls do it right and just use second-round picks to kind of keep up their, 9th through 12th players, they're in great shape and they're not going to waste a lot of money. So that's why I think this trade was good, and I don't think it was tanking. Now, what makes the tanking argument interesting, other than that, is that, the mainstream media seems to still think there's value in tanking, and we don't. And this is kind of an interesting segue because my take is I think Chicago's going to make the playoffs. I think Chicago has a good shot to get out of the first round. I mean, health is always the issue for Chicago. So Noah and Butler, if those two guys are healthy in the East, they have a great chance to get out of the first round. So I don't think this is tanking. Patrick's got an article that will be out. So this is the magic of internet editing. While we're talking about this, the article's not out. When this post is up, though, the article will be out. So we'll have a link to it in the comments below. Don't worry. But Patrick made the point about tanking and said, let's take a look at the last 9 drafts that are complete. Basically, we've seen the end of rookie contracts. So looking from the 2009 back, and I think you've got a chart up, I hope. Actually, this is interesting because normally you're off camera, so I have to just speculate as to what Brian, the ominous Brian that I always mention at the top of the links is doing. I can actually just ask you, is it up? But no, Patrick has this fantastic chart that says, look, let's look at the top 5. These are the marquee picks in any draft of the last 9 seasons. And then he says the next season people are acting as if tanking is worth it this season because everybody keeps saying it's such a deep draft. And Patrick says, like a doctor, he can predict that one of the top 5 picks in this year's draft will be a bust. He can't tell you which one. That's fine. But he can predict it. And the reason he's so confident is if we look at the drafts from 2000 to 2009, every one of those drafts had at least one player that is a bust. And we can get to some arguments, but I definitely want to clarify too. With top 5 picks, people often act as if these are franchise changers. That is, if it's going to change the history of this team, as if it was worth giving up half a season to get this player. So even if a player, so for instance, OJ Mayo is an okay player. He's good. He's not great. If they act like that was worth giving up half a season, you're just wrong. He's an okay player. You want to argue Rose, he's Rose or Love, yeah, I'll give him to you. But so the players we've got is, the Beat in 2009, Beasley in 2008, Odin in 2007, Morrison. I think Morrison's the picture you got up with the stash. In 2006, Marvin Williams, who, always lives in the shadow of Darren Williams and Chris Paul in 2005, Sean Livingston in 2004, Darko Milicic in 2003, 2002, I'm not going to say that name because I'm a Nuggets fan. 2001, it's Kwame Brown, and 2000, pretty much everybody but Kenyon Martin, and I still argue Kenyon Martin counts as a bust. Patrick's point is there are different reasons for this, right? It's not like some cases they're just overrated. They can't play basketball. Some cases they don't live up to their potential. Some cases they get injured. Something happens that makes this pick not worth it, which is why we still come back to the tanking argument. I think the figure he comes up with is 17% of top 5 picks were like worth it if we want to look at like really good players over the last, 10 drafts that we've seen out to fruition. So, if you've got 17% of a odds of a good player, is that really worth tanking for? And, of course, our answer is always no. And that's why, first off, we think the Bulls would be unwise to tank. And second off, we don't think they are. Yeah, I mean, and it's remarkable how quickly people forget this. I get in these arguments online all the time where most people make the assertion that great players tend to be top draft picks. And they're not wrong. I mean, there are, of course, players like Ben Wallace or Dennis Rodman who slip through the cracks and are much later. But a majority of the greatest of all-time players were picked very high. It is worth noting that Larry Bird was not picked top 5, was picked 6th. Anyway, we can laugh at the Golden State Warriors for that. But what we notice is, yeah, Golden State in the draft is just shooting fish in a barrel. But the point is, most great players tend to be top draft picks. Most top draft picks don't tend to turn into great players. And this is something I've been talking about online this week, actually, which is draft picks are ironically one of the most overrated and underrated things in the NBA. I was talking about how great I thought these second-round picks were because they're so cheap. They're easy value. The players they get, if you're like the San Antonio Spurs and do it right, they're just so helpful for rebuilding your team. Whereas these top draft picks that people put so much stock into that give up parts of their season that act as if they're gold usually don't pan out. So when Arturo says hit, he basically means a player that's going to average above about either .1000, which is an average NBA player in wins produced per 48, or .150, which is, a good player in wins produced per 48 over their rookie contract. You'll notice, though, neither of these distinctions is great. Like, neither of these distinctions is LeBron James, Chris Paul. And the reason I would actually laugh at Arturo if he tried to look for those hits is that those players are rare. I mean, the fun thing, right, is I've got these. Thank you very much, Patrick, for compiling this list. I've got these, you know, previous drafts up in front of me. And, okay, 2009, Harden turns great, the other four don't. 2008, Love turns great, the other four don't. Actually, this might be interesting. 2007, Durant turns great, the other four don't. 2006, none of them turn great. 2005, Chris Paul turns great. Darren Williams is very good. 2004, you got Dwight Howard. This might be the most boring thing. I'm just writing on. It looks like you basically get about one. This is interesting. You get like one star in the top five per draft. Obviously, wow, 2000 was just that was a bust year. But 2001 you had Tyson Chandler, 2002 Yao Ming, and not only that, these players may not develop initially. They may not originally be great. It may take them a few seasons to be great. So you've got kind of a sleeper agent that may turn into a great player, and you kind of have to roll the dice and hope you luck out to be the person who gets that player in the draft. The Boston and San Antonio strategies for tanking. It's worth noting that while the San Antonio strategy succeeded, that relied a lot more on luck. And 79% of the universes out there, they don't get Tim Duncan. And the Boston strategy for tanking completely failed. They did not get Greg Oden or Kevin Garnett. Although to Arturo's point, they didn't give up any assets to tank, and that let them rebuild. But you can also laugh at them because without tanking, they still could have done essentially the same moves that they did. But I agree with Arturo actually there with one caveat, which is to say, any season you can make the playoffs, and I think Patrick agrees with me here. Any season you can make the playoffs, you should not tank. I have absolutely no problem if you are a team that has no shot at the playoffs. And by the way, out east, I think every team still has a shot. It's nuts. When I was writing up that article, I was going to make the caveat that Cleveland, was clearly out of the playoffs, so it was a laugh that they were going to swap picks or whatever, their lottery predicted pick. But that's actually next year. But I was looking at that. They're still in it. They're only 6 games out with 50 games in the season. So, any year you can make the playoffs, tanking is the wrong move because the playoffs are just worth so much money. I think we've been talking about this before the show. It's like $1 million a game at least. Not only that, it's worth goodwill to the fans. If you make the playoffs, trying to sell season tickets next year, your fans will want to come back. So if you're out of the playoffs and you don't have to give up assets and you can lose games to increase your odds of making it in the draft, I agree with that. But understand that most of the time, by the time you realize you're out of the playoffs and don't have to give up assets, at least half the season's gone. And the number of games you can improve yourself by doing that is not significant because there are other teams that are already bad as well. Okay, so yeah, like I said, draft picks are really nuanced. The real value of second round picks is that they're super, super cheap, that teams are really bad at the draft, so there's still talent to be found if you're looking. It's worth noting that Manu Ginobili was the very last player selected in his draft class. If you're like San Antonio and are willing to let players gestate overseas in Europe, they're even more valuable because it means the player gets older and are really useful. It's rough on San Antonio because they had to sell him off, but Luis Scola went back when he was good, was a draft pick that they picked, up late, and he played overseas in Europe. So when you quantify draft picks, top picks are definitely worth it. Like they're very valuable. They're just overpriced because the cost to get them, you have to lose lots of games, is just too high. Second round draft picks are incredibly valuable, especially because most people don't think they have value and that they get you excellent contracts. And one of the things you had been saying about that was if you get a player on a second round draft pick, drafted, versus hiring a player on a contract, you get one more year. You get, an extra year of them. So every second round pick, gets you one extra year of a really good contract. So, I mean, I know that doesn't quite answer it because, if Arturo were on the show, I know for a fact he'd be pulling up the spreadsheets and telling you the dollar amount. But the simple point is draft picks are fantastic if you want to fill out your roster. High draft picks are great if you don't have to give up a lot for them. Case in point, the Nuggets who traded away Melo on a rental to get draft picks for, essentially nothing. That's about all I have to say on that. It's complicated and nuanced, as you mentioned. Okay, well, I got to give it just a mad shout out. This is an article in the past, but rest assured I'll be doing more work with it to Ben Noah, who collected all of this data on NBA coaches that let me do an article about basically race versus players and race versus coaches in the NBA. Joe Price at Brigham Young University also gave me his data. So, mad thanks to both of those. Rest assured, more of that is coming. We've got some ideas. Devin Dignam, who's been taking a winter holiday, should be back soon. And he's been looking at the idea of the Eastern All-Stars versus the Western All-Stars and if it's really as clear cut as you think. He thinks